And I'll start off with a feedback story, a story of me receiving feedback about 20 years ago, and it may give you some sense of how I got interested in this topic of getting better at receiving feedback. So this was 20 years ago. My colleague and co-author, Sheila Heen, she and I had been invited by an organization to write a report about their organizational culture, and they were having issues around lots of issues. And Sheila and I had never written a report before for an organization like this, so we were very excited to do it. We worked really hard on it. We submitted it to the CEO. We felt good about it. And the CEO did something which was a little striking at the time, which was we submitted it on a Wednesday afternoon, and he called up right away and said, I need to talk to you. Meet with me in Washington, D.C. We were in Boston. Meet with me Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Sheila, being weirdly optimistic, said, wow, this is so exciting. He's like so eager to talk to us about it. He must love it. I was a little more concerned. So we show up the next morning, and this CEO, just have to say, he had been a former All-American hammer thrower in college. He was like 6'4", former military guy too, really big guy. So we show up, we sit there, we're sitting literally opposite him. He's got his, I was about to use the word henchman, he's got his leadership team arrayed around him, and he takes the report, and his first words to us, well, his first communication to us wasn't even words. He throws the report at me, and then he follows up and he says, throws the report, this is shit. So I was thinking, this meeting is not going well. So my reaction, so we've gotten some feedback, right? We did some work, and we got feedback. And I'm thinking, okay, we submitted something, we're getting feedback. How do you receive feedback? So my reaction was just to panic and say nothing. Sheila, who tends to be a cooler head in those kind of settings, her reaction, she had a little bit of panic too, but she has this rule, which is if you don't know what to do, if you're a little panicky, you're unsure, just ask a question. That's always, by the way, that's the number one rule in life, really. So Sheila pulls out of her head the only question she can think of, which is, when you say shit, could you be a little more specific? And I'm sort of looking at her like, you know, if we had any chance of living through this, you've just ruined it. But miraculously, so for the guy's a little bit taken aback, but then he starts answering the question, and he goes, well, okay, so turn to page 14, and we look at 14, and he says, what's wrong with that? And he starts going through each page that he had concerns with, and tells us what he didn't like about it. And it turned the sort of accumulation of the things he didn't like were all things that were actually just real feedback that we could work on. And so we did, and we ended up working with them for about 10 years and gained their trust and did good work with them, et cetera. So what I took from that experience was that you can respond well and less well to feedback. And Sheila had responded well, and maybe I had responded less well. And I decided, at some point in my life, I've got to kind of investigate this. And that was sort of led to the book, Thanks for the Feedback, that Sheila and I wrote a few years back. So the topic, receiving feedback, usually when I start a talk like this, I'm kind of making a pitch for why receiving feedback is so important. It just occurs to me, here's my clicker. But it's my sense, I was reading through the Future of Philanthropy, the CEO perspective material that CEP put out, and I was astonished to find this in it. So the CEP polled different CEOs in foundations, and they asked them, what are top practices that hold significant promise for increasing foundations' impact in the coming decades? And the feedback to me, that should say 1 and 2, not 1 and 1. The top one, foundations seeking to learn from the experience of those they are trying to help. And the second one, learning from, the second one, learning from grantees. And so that's all about feedback, obviously. So of the whole range of things that people saw as possibly being important to the impact of the work, the first two are just dead on about getting better or getting good at receiving feedback. So it's my sense that foundations are dedicated to that, and I think rightly so. And then the question becomes, well, so how do you do that? And obviously, it's not easy, right? It's challenging. It's challenging for individuals to receive feedback well. It's challenging for organizations. There's a particular challenge associated with foundations, I think, just for the structural reasons around power, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The CEP's work around the grantee perception reports, I think, does an amazing job of sort of pushing things forward in that category of finding ways around some of the structural challenges that foundations have. And I know some of you are familiar with that and some of you may not be. But even with that, so that I think is fantastic, and even with that, I'm mindful of what Brian Stevenson was saying at last night's presentation, which is get proximate, right? And so I think in the domain of feedback, in addition to whatever else you're doing, we need to find ways to really just be talking directly to other people. And so I'm going to be kind of making that case. So I'm going to be, in the sort of background of my talk is how do foundations get feedback and how do they use it? But in the foreground, really what I want to be focusing on is how do you individually hear feedback, receive feedback, and engage well with feedback. Foundations, of course, are just groups of people. And so my focus is really going to be on you as individuals, and we'll make references back and forth a little bit as well. So what makes receiving feedback hard? Sometimes it's not hard, right? When you do really well at something or someone says they love you and you love them. I mean, we get positive feedback all the time, and that's not so hard. But some feedback really is tough, right? And what is it about it that makes it so tough? So I would assert that part of it is that feedback often sits on the juncture, the sort of intersection of two really core human needs. So on the one hand, human beings, we're sort of programmed, we're wired to learn and grow and to want to learn and grow. The literature, the research on happiness is very consistent with this, where when you gain mastery at some topic, your happiness level tends to go up. And just the process of learning makes us happy, makes us feel competent, et cetera. Children, of course, are the example. Like, children are just ravenous to learn, and they're asking questions, et cetera. But even as we grow older, and even in retirement, people are learning new skills, they're taking on hobbies, et cetera. So human beings are really wired to learn. And if that were the end of the story, we would just be little feedback receiving machines, I think. But that's not the end of the story. Because at the same time in our lives, we have what is arguably an even more important core need, which is we want to be accepted for who we are now, right? And whether it's at work or whether it's in our personal lives, it seems like the world has an agenda for us about all these upgrades that keep needing to happen. And it's not that we're against the upgrades, it's that we need to know that we're safe and loved and respected and accepted just as we already are. And these two things are in tension. There's no sort of answer. There's no way to make this tension magically disappear. But our goal today is to sort of help us engage more successfully and maybe lower some of the tension as we go along. How many would say, by the way, that in your life you've learned some of the most powerful lessons from some of the most painful experiences? Yeah, so these things kind of go together sometimes, which doesn't mean we should just be resigned to the pain, but just an awareness that receiving feedback can be tough. So what I'd like you to do is take a couple minutes and think of a time in your life when you received some advice or coaching or feedback that you chose not to take. So you chose not to take it. Just sort of get it in your head for a minute, and in about 5 or 8 minutes, we're going to come back to this. But I just want you to sort of have it in your head as we're moving along. So just to define terms, we tend to use feedback, just the general word, and we know what it is when we use it, and it has whatever meaning we assign it. But really, it's useful to be aware that there are 3 separate categories, 3 types of feedback, and each kind is motivated by a different purpose. And one of the more useful things to be aware of as you get better at receiving feedback is just what kind of feedback are you getting in this moment? What kind of feedback did you want? What are you getting? And also, on the flip side, what kind of feedback are you giving? And is it the category of feedback somebody wants? So the shorthand of the 3 categories is ACE. A stands for appreciation. So appreciation is just the kind of feedback that says, thank you, I notice you, I see what you specifically are doing. And all human beings need appreciation. We want different kinds of appreciation. Different people have different sort of languages of appreciation. For some people, their paycheck, it's like, hey, I work here, I get paid, that tells me that things are going well, that makes me happy. Other people want to be told expressly and explicitly that they're appreciated, et cetera. But everyone needs their own kind of appreciation. Before I started working as a consultant, I worked at the Harvard Negotiation Project, and my boss for about 8 years was a guy named Roger Fisher, who was one of the pioneers of the field of conflict resolution. And a bunch of years into it, I turned in a memo to him, some, 5-page thing, and he turned it back, and there were just like 3 little grammatical corrections. And he kind of said, here you go. And that was sort of like the last straw from my point of view. He was a great guy and a great boss, but I very skillfully turned around and said something really sarcastic, which I don't recommend, by the way. So I said, Roger, by the way, if I ever do something well, you should feel free to tell me. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I just don't get any appreciation. I don't know if I used that word, but that was what I meant in terms of the category. I said, I don't get any appreciation, ever. I get like little corrections. And he said, what are you talking about? I appreciate you every day. And I sort of looked to see if maybe he was talking to somebody behind me. And I said, Roger, I've been here. I would know if that happened. And he said, do we work together? And I said, yeah. And he goes, do we enjoy working together? And I said, yeah. And he said, that happens every day. And he said, that's how I know you appreciate me, and that's how you know I appreciate you. And I reflected on that, and I realized that he and I just had different ways of thinking about what does it mean to feel or to know that you're appreciated. And I think genuinely, Roger took the interaction as the appreciation, and maybe it may have just been also our asymmetrical power levels or whatever, but I wanted to hear it sort of explicitly. The Department of Labor in the United States did a survey a number of years ago, and they found out that 93% of American workers felt underappreciated at work. That's a lot of people. They also found in the same study that almost 50% of the people who left their jobs voluntarily, in other words, they weren't fired or laid off, almost 50% of them cited lack of appreciation as the top reason why they were leaving. So there's obviously something going on around the topic of appreciation and feedback. A second kind of feedback is coaching, and this is just what it sounds like, which is this is how we get better, right? This is how we expand our knowledge and increase our skill. This is when someone says, here's how you could do it better, or try it this way, here's an idea I have, let me teach you, etc. So this coaching is really at the heart of the kind of feedback that we're looking for certainly in our business lives and in our personal lives as well, when we're trying to just improve. And finally, evaluation. Evaluation is basically, it sort of ranks or rates you against some kind of standard or some kind of comparison. It tells you where you're at. Evaluation is very important. It's in many ways, it's the toughest kind of feedback to get because you might be evaluated lower than you think you should be, and that can be really upsetting. But one way or another, we need to know where we stand so that we can either feel good about that or work to improve. So some of the challenges that come in, the two big challenges relating to this set of ideas is, the first one is that appreciation, as I've already mentioned, tends to sort of drop out, especially in a work environment. It's never an emergency to appreciate somebody, right? It's not like we have an emergency, I need you in my office this moment. It's an emergency, all hell will break loose if I don't tell you that, things are going pretty nicely. So it's never an emergency, so it's like the last thing, it's the thing that's going to get dropped. Also, I think there's a tendency, people know innately that appreciation should be genuine, right? And so people feel like, well, I don't want to just say like, hey, you're doing a great job, if I don't think the person's doing a great job. So the reason I haven't appreciated this person for the last 4 years is I've been waiting for them to do a great job. And there's a way in which that makes sense, because I totally agree, appreciation should be, it has to be genuine. The problem with that little example is you have to find, if you're not finding things to appreciate, then you're just not alert enough to the kind of things the person's doing. You're not saying they're an A+, doing an amazing job if they're a B-, but you're appreciating the things that they are doing well, even if they're also doing some things less well. A final note on appreciation is it should be specific. We all know that feeling, and I'm guilty of giving feedback like this as well, where the appreciation is nice job, great work, and then the sort of do differently, the critical feedback is, there's 117 things I want you to improve. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, the good work applies to the whole thing. So that's like a lot of appreciation. And then the changes are just like little things. But we experience the detailed feedback as the real feedback, obviously. So you can give very specific positive appreciation, not just for the morale booster, but also because it tells people what they're doing well so that they can keep doing that well. A second challenge relating to these three categories is that coaching and evaluation often get kind of mixed together in challenging ways for the receiver. So evaluation can be very emotionally loud. Think back when you were a student in high school or college and your professor returned a paper. What's the first thing you do when you get a paper back in the days when people had papers that they turned in? You rush to the end of the paper and you look at what the grade is, right? And if the grade is good, you don't have to look at the other comments because the grade is is good. You don't need to do anything. If the grade is bad, you don't have to look at the comments because you're just like, who cares what this professor thinks? He's an idiot. But the first thing you do is you look at the grade, and that's going to be sort of your emotional, the tenor of your emotional reaction is going to be the grade. And then the comments will be sort of maybe you look at them, maybe you won't, and maybe later, whatever. So evaluation carries a big emotional weight. And if you evaluate someone and coach them together at the same time, it's almost superhuman to expect that they're going to take in the coaching in that moment. So the recommendation is to try to separate them out as much as possible in time and in space. A challenge around all of this is that I'm describing these as if coaching and evaluation are just completely separate categories, but really you can read anything as either to some extent. It might be more one or more the other, but you can interpret it as either. So for example, imagine, so we're in Boston. Let's say that you live in Boston and you've had a friend visit you from out of town. And you're driving that friend from out of town. The weekend is over. They came for the weekend. You're driving the friend back to Logan Airport so they can fly out. And halfway there, as you're driving, they say, there's a faster way to get to Logan. And they start describing it. So is that coaching or is that evaluation, right? If it's coaching, they're saying, hey, I can teach you something that will be good for you, good for me. It will help you, right? It's a good thing. It will help your skill in getting Logan. If it's evaluation, what's the evaluation? You're an idiot, right? You've been living in Boston all this time, and you don't know the best way to get to the airport. What's wrong with you? You don't pay attention, whatever. And you can argue that it's both of those. Partly it doesn't matter technically what it actually is. Partly it depends on the sort of intention of the person giving the feedback. But from the receiver's point of view, this is just a general guideline. To the extent that you can hear feedback in either category, it's best to do what we call sorting toward coaching. In other words, as you're sorting feedback, if you can put something in the coaching category, put it in the coaching category, because it'll have less sort of emotional sting, and it will help you actually learn and get better at something. The grantee perception reports are sort of framed, for example, they're framed as evaluation, and there's certainly evaluation in there, but I think the purpose behind them, there's some of the purpose is evaluation. I think a lot of the purpose is coaching. This is an evaluation in the hope that you'll learn from this and make improvements along the way and get better. And I think that's a healthy, useful way to hear feedback. Now, some feedback is just straight evaluation. So it's not about pretending that there's no evaluation. It's about also trying to finding the coaching in evaluation as well. Okay, so it's very useful to be aware of what kind of feedback are you getting, what kind of feedback did you want to get, and this is also something you can sort of do an audit on in your life. You can ask yourself, in these categories, at my job, in my personal relationships, am I getting all three in the degrees that I think would be useful for me? And if not, how can I go about trying to elicit that? Okay, so I want to come back to the question. Oops, not these questions. To the question that I asked you earlier, which is to think of a piece of advice or feedback that you received in your life that you did not take. And I want you to think about why was it that you chose not to take it? And I want to give you a few moments to turn to somebody at your table, one person, two people, whatever group size is natural, and just kind of share those stories if you feel comfortable doing that. And then we'll see if we can get a few people to report out in the big group, just so not necessarily the details of the story, but particularly I'm interested in the whys of the story, just so that we get some grist around the feedback. So a piece of feedback you chose not to take, and why, if you can remember, why did you choose not to take the feedback? So take a couple of minutes for that. Let me ask, anyone want to, I can't really see hands, but anyone want to just kind of shout out the why? Why did you choose not to take feedback? You wanted to prove them wrong by sort of doing it a different way and succeeding? Sure, okay. So you want to prove them wrong, interesting. What other reasons?
Did not trust them.
Did not trust them, right. What's motivating them? Are they trying to make you better or worse? What else?
We want to do something hard.
Didn't want to do something hard. Yeah, this might be a great piece of feedback, but it's going to require me to do extra stuff that I'm not up for. What else?
Better sense of the full context.
You have a better sense of the full context. Yeah. How often is it when we get feedback from other people, the structure of that is that we know everything about our life and they might know some tiny little sliver and they're giving us this big speech about how we can improve. I'm elaborating on your... so they don't know us as well as we know us, so how can they tell us what to do? Other reasons?
We just didn't like the advice.
Yeah, we didn't like the advice. You want to say what category of not liking? Why wouldn't we like some advice?
Wasn't what we wanted to hear.
Wasn't what we wanted to hear because it was critical or just wrong or all of the above?
I'm going to take what someone over there says. It's uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable. Oh, yeah. Feedback for me. So the feedback might make us uncomfortable, so we're not going to go in that direction. Any that we haven't heard yet?
No, the feedback was unsolicited.
Unsolicited. Yeah. So, yeah, what makes you think that I had asked you what you thought about my new significant other? Yeah, so that's very much about the process of the feedback, right? There was one other one over here. Yeah?
I didn't know how to make the change.
I didn't know how to do it. That's like, when I was in high school, I was a high jumper, and the coach, he was a specialized high jump coach, and his advice to me was to jump higher. And I felt that advice was right on target, but I just wasn't sure how to do it. So it doesn't matter how good it is or how much you want to do it if you don't know how to get it done. Okay, so these are all reasons why we don't take feedback, and these reasons are probably sort of reasonable reasons, right? And sometimes they may be even good reasons. But what I want to suggest is that very often the reactions that we have to feedback, although justifiable and normal and human and even rational and reasonable, can sometimes get in the way of not just taking the feedback, but understanding the feedback in the first place. So it's not that I'm judging the reasons, I'm just observing that sometimes the reactions that we have and what I'm going to call triggered reactions can make it hard to sort of then step back and really just see what the feedback is. So we heard a lot of different reasons why we may not have taken feedback in the past. And I want to suggest that we can take a whole list, and I've done this with lots of different groups, we can take lots of different particular reasons and put them into 3 categories of responses to feedback. And by doing that, it gives us some leverage around understanding our own tendencies when we get feedback and to kind of organizing it and then thinking about how we might change those reactions if we choose to. So we call these the 3 triggered reactions. And the first kind of reaction is what we call truth triggers. And by this, I mean our reaction is based on the idea that there's something off about the feedback itself. It's wrong, it's out of date, you ask the wrong people, it's not based on a sufficient knowledge of my job or my work or my life, etc. There's lots of ways we can kind of disqualify feedback just based on the fact that it's wrong. Now, up to this point, you might be thinking, yeah, so feedback is wrong. What's the point of, am I supposed to still take wrong feedback? Should I not have a reaction if feedback's wrong? What should I do? So no, have a reaction, and also choose not to take it if you choose to. And I should step back at this point and say, by the way, receiving feedback well doesn't equal taking feedback. Receiving feedback well may mean that you take it, but it also may mean that you reject it. But receiving feedback well, in my definition, means engaging skillfully and understanding it first, and then making a choice about whether you want to take it or not. So if feedback seems wrong or unhelpful in some way, you should not take it, right? Life is too short. You have enough good feedback to take without having to worry about taking feedback that makes no sense. If someone comes up to me and says, Bob, you were domineering in that meeting and obnoxious, and you got to step back a little and let other people talk and stop interrupting, I might be thinking, so first, I was not at that meeting, and second, my name's not Bob, so I am not going to take this feedback. I don't think you should say, well, I got this feedback, I got to really change the way Bob goes to meetings, or I go to meetings. So yeah, if feedback is wrong. But so the problem, though, around this trigger isn't that we're supposed to take feedback that's wrong. The challenge is that very often it's hard to know what the feedback means when we have that instinctive reaction right up front that this is wrong. So what do we do about that? And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Relationship triggers is the second kind of trigger, where this is a trigger that relates not so much to the what of the feedback, but the who of the feedback, right? Who's giving it to us? And it's easy to disqualify, and we heard a lot of examples of this. It's easy to disqualify feedback based on who's giving it to us, and sometimes for very valid reasons. We may not trust them, we may not trust their motives, we may not think they know what they're talking about. It might just be the relationship, like, my dad's not the right person to give me this feedback. I could hear it from someone else, but not from my father. In the field of philanthropy and foundations, if a foundation is kind of riding a grantee hard on their impact and outcomes, and then the grantee gives the foundation feedback, it would be easy to say, well, of course they're going to be critical because we've been critical of them. So, they're just giving us what they're getting. And that's a way of letting the we, the who it is, interfere with the actual feedback itself. And the advice here is just simply separate them. Try, to the extent that you can, take the feedback on its own merits. What is it that they're saying? Does it make sense to me based on just the feedback itself? And then if there are relationship challenges, also glossing over that, a gloss of relationship challenges, try to deal with those separately. The final category is what we call identity triggers. And these are, we all go through life sort of with a sense of who we are, a very shorthand sense that you're a good person, a good parent, a good employee, you're competent, you're whatever it is for you. You're funny, you're hardworking, you care. And when some core aspect of how you see yourself feels threatened by feedback, it's really hard to take that feedback in. Not because the feedback's right or wrong, and may not have anything to do with the relationship. It just has to do with how you see yourself and the relationship between the feedback and your sense of yourself in the world. So if we feel that this feedback is threatening, it could be materially threatening. If it somehow threatens our well-being in some way, that's going to be hard feedback to take in. But it could just be threaten how we see ourselves, our identity. So the more aware you are of that trigger, the sort of better you are able to kind of unwind that. What a lot of people do, including myself, when we get feedback that feels threatening, is we don't just react to the feedback itself, we distort the feedback. So the threat itself ends up distorting the feedback, so the feedback becomes much bigger and much scarier and much worse than it really actually is. So the advice for around identity triggers is not, pretend it's not happening. It's try to do your best cognitively to hear the feedback the actual size that it is, and if you can do that, you'll be in a better position to take it in, because if it's, once it gets too big, especially if it's not really that big, then it's going to be impossible to take in. So I want to spend my remaining time talking about truth triggers. And I'm going to put up a sentence here that you've either said or been told or maybe heard someone else tell someone. And I want you to just brainstorm quickly what a range of meanings could be for this sentence. So you can sort of shout these out.
My sixth grader says it to me.
Your sixth grader said it to you. And your sixth grader meant, what did your sixth grader mean? Just literally, the pants don't look good.
Exactly what she means.
That's exactly what she means. Okay. What else?
Fat.
Yeah, it's not the pants, it's you. What else? The pants are ugly. It is the pants. It's not you. I prefer your other pants. So there's a backhand compliment, perhaps, right? Okay, so we could go on. I'll give you I'll put up here a few that I've heard in the past, and kind of a range. Those particular. So this is just very literal, very direct. It's a whole category, really. It's not so much the pants, but it's you. It's not so much you, it's your whole kind of personality. So this one's about the relationship, and then this tragic one is. Let's hope we don't go there. Just informationally, the place that this little question comes from is when I was writing the book, Thanks for the Feedback, we were looking for an example of feedback that you could hear in lots of different ways, even though the person that said it thought they were being clear. And the example is me telling my brother at Thanksgiving. He walked in, and I said, just even before I could think, I said, I don't like the way those pants look on you. And then just all hell broke loose. So it occurred to me eventually, we finally realized that it was sort of number 4. So, and the conversation didn't end until, by the way, we discussed the implications that my comment had for capitalism. But anyway, it's not a good thing. So what I learned, among other things, is it's not a good thing to say to your brother. But also, when I said it, I literally meant, I don't like that pair of pants. And he heard it in a completely different way. And so it was kind of a good reminder and lesson. And in fact, this sort of tracks how, not always, but how feedback is often going on between people, where the person giving the feedback thinks they're being clear in some specific way. They have an image of what they think the feedback means. And the person getting it may hear it very differently. Not because either person is doing anything nefarious or being dumb or willfully unhelpful, but just both people are trying to do their best, but they're meaning and hearing very different things. We call this the label challenge, where one thing that makes feedback hard to understand is it's often delivered very much as just kind of labels. And I'll give you an example. So this example, organizational one, be more transparent. Actually, I'll give you a different one first. So a little while ago, I received feedback from a work colleague, well, from several work colleagues, that I was being overly critical in our team meetings. So I'll walk you through my triggered reactions and way of discussing it, and I'll tell you in advance that we got to a place where I really did understand the feedback, but it was mostly because of the skill of the person giving it to me. But it kind of went like this. They said, "You're being overly critical." And I said, well, I'm sort of exaggerating here, but I said something to the effect of, "I am like the nicest person in the office." So that feedback is just raw. I didn't even have to spend 2 seconds on that feedback. And they said, "Well, I didn't, you are very nice. I didn't mention nice or not nice. I just said critical." And I said, "But I feel like I'm incredibly generous and friendly," and we kind of went back and forth on that for a while. And finally what came out, and I was thinking, and furthermore, I really think the people in this office are great, so how could I be overly critical? So I was kind of having trouble taking this in and resisting, but it was also occurring to me that, it was occurring to both of us, that I didn't even know what they're talking about, right? Which is a common pattern. I'm very willing to decide that this is wrong, and yet I don't have the slightest idea what they're telling me. So we finally said, so be specific, what are we talking about? And they said, well, here's an example. In the meeting, that you sort of have a pattern when someone offers a new idea, people kind of look and say, well, so what's Doug's going to shoot it down? What's the thing he's going to say to tell us why it's not going to work? And then I was thinking, well, if an idea is not going to work, I'm not going to pretend it does work. But I was also thinking, but I feel like that it's true that I do that, but it's at least as true that I'm incredibly encouraging of people's ideas also. So if I'm occasionally critical, and it was pretty occasional, and I'm often very encouraging, then what's the balance of this? So now we're kind of having the real conversation, at least about the topic. And they said, okay, good, we're getting somewhere. This business about you being encouraging, what are you talking about? And I said, well, and then it suddenly dawned on me that my mode very often in meetings is I'm sort of thinking, the meeting's going well. If I don't need to jump in and say something I don't need to say things just for my benefit. So I try to kind of edit myself as much as possible. And I try to say only the things that are going to really be useful or additive in some way. And I suddenly realized in that moment that so much of the positive, encouraging thoughts that I have, that I'm genuinely having, are just only in my head. And I'm not saying them out loud. So I'm going through a meeting where I'm thinking, wow, that's a great idea. That's a brilliant idea. And I'm also thinking, I didn't need to say that because we're having a meeting. People are trying to get through it quickly. And so that was very helpful to me to learn that about sort of how I'm being perceived and what I'm doing. But just on the surface, the sort of label of you're being too critical, I didn't know what that applied to. It didn't sound right. I couldn't make any sense of it. So it's only in the conversation, the proximity, to put it that way. It's only in the course of the conversation where I'm, at first I'm just disagreeing, but eventually I'm saying, well, help me understand this. What's this based on? What are some examples? And a very useful way to think about it is to just ask sort of big picture 2 questions. One is a backward-looking question, which is, where does this feedback come from? What's it based on? What did you see? What's the data? And then a forward-looking question, what would you like to see differently? If I were doing it well, if I were going to make it, if I were going to do something that you would think was a good thing, what would that look and sound like? Between these two questions, you can really start to get under the label. Imagine in the foundation context that a grantee offers the feedback around, you need to be more transparent. This is more or less based on a true story. So a grantee's asked for feedback. The grantee gives a bunch of feedback. And the feedback is you need to be, so among other things, be more transparent. And the foundation's thinking, hey, we actually rate really well on transparency. We're very clear about what our criteria are, how we make decisions, et cetera. We're open to talking to people. So the foundation is kind of like, that's just that piece of feedback is a little off. And it turned out what the grantee meant, and this is not to say who's right or wrong or to blame anybody, but just observing the communication dynamic. When the grantee said be more transparent, that was in reference to a very specific thing, which didn't have to do with what the foundation was thinking. The grantee had been invited to do some brainstorming on the strategic direction of the foundation, which the grantee was very grateful for and appreciated and felt included and felt they could be useful. And so did that, and then from the grantee's point of view, from the foundation's point of view, they took that and did whatever they did with it, and it was useful to them and whatever was useful. From the grantee's point of view, he showed up, did this thing for a couple hours, and then never heard back about was that good? Was that bad? Did anyone do anything with the information that we generated? Was it presented to the board? Was it presented to the CEO? Was it off target? What? So from the grantee's point of view, there's kind of a black box there. And again, the point of the story is not to say the foundation has to describe everything, but just that this was feedback in the grantee's mind, and by sharing a label of being more transparent, it wasn't really communicated very well to the foundation, and the foundation, based on that label, simply ended up rejecting it and not learning whatever it was that the grantee wanted to communicate. So when we're either giving or receiving feedback, it's really important to sort of spot the labels. Ask yourself, what's the information conveyed here? Would someone know what I'm trying to get at when I say this? And then if not, to try to ask yourself, what's the data? What did I observe, and what could this person do differently? And when you're on the receiving end, just use these as questions. So I just want to cover a couple more things quickly as we wind up here. So a couple complicating factors. So another factor that makes understanding feedback a challenge is that we all have blind spots. So as individuals, we clearly have blind spots, right? So right now, everybody, I believe, in this room can see my face. Who's the only person here who can't see my face? I can't see my face, right? So as well as I know myself, and as well as I feel like I'm the person that knows the most about me, every person in this room has a category of information about me that I don't have. So any communication that I'm offering intentionally or very often unintentionally through my facial expressions is something you know a lot more about than I know. And it's actually also true, so facial expressions are a big part of how we read other people's communications. So that's a blind spot for me. A second big part of how we read other people's communications is tone of voice. And you might say, well, that's right, but that's not a blind spot because you can hear yourself. Interestingly and astonishingly, in my view, we can hear the words that we say, but we actually hear ourselves through a different part of our brain than we hear other people. So the abbreviation is STS, the technical name, I can't remember. But there's a part of our brain that is dedicated solely to interpreting the tonal meaning of language. And it develops when we're like 7 months old. And that's the only thing that it does. Before 7 months, you hear human voices just with your regular hearing that you would use to hear, a knock at the door. But then after that, you hear it's very attuned to the tonal shifts in language. But when we ourselves speak, that actually gets bypassed in some way, or turned off or turned down. So we hear ourselves speak through the mechanisms that we hear, like the door knocking. And so we're missing some information around it. And it's partly why we have these arguments about, don't use that tone of voice with me. Not using any tone of voice, what are you talking about? And we go back and forth. It also accounts for why when we hear ourselves on video or tape, our immediate reaction is, that's not how I sound, right? And that's a weird assertion, because obviously it is how we sound, and yet we know that it's not how we sound. But it's because when we hear ourselves on tape, we are hearing it through the STS, so it has a different tone to it. So tone is another kind of semi-blind spot that we have. And there's a whole bunch of categories of ways in which other people experience us in ways that we don't have access to. And when we get feedback in those blind spots, it can be surprising or difficult. But organizations also have blind spots. Just sort of metaphorically, it's very hard to see your organization as other people outside the organization see the organization. And it's both organizationally and personally, there's a blind spot, which is that we all feel like we know that people have blind spots because we can think of a million blind spots that the people around us have. And we also are aware that, well, it's good that we don't have any blind spots, because if we had blind spots, we would know about them and we would fix them. And that is literally called the blind spot, which is that most people feel like, yeah, I'm totally on board with this blind spot thing, but I don't have any. And that obviously is a blind spot. So what's the fix for this? The only way to get feedback in a blind spot, personally or organizationally, is just, you can't think your way out of it. You just have to assume that you have blind spots, counter to what your brain tells you, and then try to get feedback that will help you correct that. And it has to be from the outside. Finally, look at those graphics. Foundation grantees. So this is just a graphic meant to point out that it's hard for foundations due sometimes to power imbalances or to fear that results from that. It can be hard for foundations to get genuine and honest feedback. As we said, the grantee perception report is a very useful mechanism for trying to deal with that. So third-party anonymous aggregation of feedback can be really important. But I think a second sort of category is, to the extent that you can, try to cultivate individual relationships with grantees or beneficiaries where there's enough trust built up over enough time that they can be your sort of designated truth teller in terms of offering you feedback. And the only way that that's going to happen is you have to kind of persuade them that you really want this feedback, you really want to know what their ideas are or how you're perceived or ways that you could improve, and that it's going to be good for them, not bad for them, or at least neutral for them, and that you sort of acknowledge. If they say, well, think of it from my point of view, what's the cost-benefit analysis to me of telling you the various things that I find less useful about what you're doing, instead of saying like, well, don't worry about it, trust us, we're not going to do anything bad, just try to understand it. So how does it impact your calculation? What do you think? How does it impact your behavior? And then just try to problem solve. So this is the dynamic that we're in together. How can we manage it? What can we do? What could we do differently that would give you reassurance around that? Let me stop there. I'll share one last thing, and then I think we might have time for a couple questions. One really useful thing to do when you're soliciting or eliciting feedback is, instead of saying, what's your feedback, which is very general, and it's a yes-no question, Ask people, what's one thing that we can do differently that would help, that would either help us, that would make your life easier? What's one thing that we could do differently? And people, surprisingly, tend to be much more open to usefully answering that question than they are, do you have any feedback for us? Let me stop there. What time is it? We have, okay, we do have a few minutes for questions. So there's mics around the room. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Hi there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on a technique.
Where's
over here, to your left.
To my left.
Here, in the back.
Oh, okay. I do see.
Okay,
people over there.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on a technique that I heard called a criticism sandwich.
Yeah.
Where you say something affirming and positive, and then you slip in the criticism, and then you follow up with something affirming. Does that really work? I've used it, and and just want to know your thoughts.
I'm using my STS part of my brain to read the tone of your question, and it's telling me that you're skeptical. So yeah, the feedback sandwich. So if you ordered a sandwich and you said, I would like a sandwich and I'd like it to have the following things. I'd like it to have a slice of bread, a couple slices of ham, and then at the bottom, I prefer another slice of bread. What was that sandwich commonly called? A ham sandwich, right? No one calls that a ham bread sandwich. So when you give positive feedback and negative feedback and positive feedback, people experience it that way, I think. So I guess my short answer would be, for me, the bedrock rule is feedback has to be genuine, whatever it is. It's a good idea if you have some difficult feedback for somebody and some positive feedback to share the positive feedback as well as the challenging feedback. I don't think, though, that I think part of the challenge is if the negative feedback is going to be negative enough that it's going to be upsetting, then starting with the positive is just setting the person up to be ambushed. I think so. It's just a judgment, I think, in each situation. But the sandwich itself, I don't think really gets you out of anything particularly. But I think it's a good reminder that making sure that you're finding positive things to say, genuine positive things to say, is important. Other questions?
How do you respond to feedback without sounding defensive?
How do you respond to feedback without just sounding defensive? That is a great question. So I think that you can even disagree with feedback without sounding defensive by recognizing that this other person has their perspective and you have your perspective. So if you frame it, I know people who just frame everything as it's right or it's wrong. And if you're saying, look, you gave me that feedback, but your feedback is wrong, that's going to annoy the other person. It might sound defensive. If you say, look, I want to really understand your perspective, but I also want to share my perspective on this. Here's why I see this differently. I think it sounds much less defensive than, that's wrong, or I'm not going to listen to that. But it starts with a better, an underlying assumption that your feedback is based on a perception, and my reaction to it is based on a perception as well. And I'm very, very interested in understanding where your feedback comes from and making sure I get it. But I also want you to understand why I'm thinking it might not apply to me, or it wouldn't work if I tried to do it the way that you want me to do it. The key phrase is, I want to understand how you see it, and I want to explain, I want to share why I see certain aspects of that differently. We have time for one more question. Yeah.
It seems that at the core of what you're telling us for receiving feedback is that we have to make it non-threatening. We have to take the sort of personal reaction out of it and look at it more objectively for what it is. And I'm just wondering, you haven't talked a lot about techniques for doing that. When somebody says something, you think, for sort of taking that part of it out of the equation.
Yeah, so this is when the CEO throws the document at me and says, this is whatever, and I'm panicked. It's what, you could say, well, so the good way to do this is number one, don't panic. So part of it is that people are human beings and we're going to have human reactions to everything. So don't then have another reaction, which is critiquing yourself for having a reaction, because we're just going to go through life periodically. We're going to do things that are less helpful to us or less skilled, et cetera. But there are things I think we can do that kind of mitigate the problem a little bit. So a couple thoughts. One is to think before the conversation, to the extent that conversation is not just out of the blue. Think before the conversation, what are some of the things they could say to us? If they don't like it, how would that make me feel? And what could I say in response? If they offered this critique, this critique, this critique. So doing that, it's kind of an inoculation effect a little bit. In the moment, again, different people have different levels of reactions. But I do think it's almost always a good thing to ask a question, to sort of, we want to run away from feedback we don't like or that's upsetting, but instead saying, tell me more about that. The more specific feedback gets, in many ways, the less upsetting it is, because the first volley into the feedback might be very global and general, but as they get more specific, it's like, okay, that does make sense. If someone says, this presentation was terrible, I'm thinking that's upsetting. If they say, this aspect was not as clear as it could be, I'm thinking, okay, so let's look at that. Another last comment is a technique that I think is useful is just to literally make a list for yourself, to say, what is this feedback actually about? And make a list, like it's about these three things. But what is it not about? To the extent that we distort feedback or exaggerate it or we catastrophize, making lists of what it's not about is really reassuring, because you can rule out, first of all, it's not about my past, right? It's feedback about the present, so I don't have to decide how I used to be. It may not be about the future. It may be about this one talk and only a part of the talk. So you're not trying to list what it is or isn't about so that you can decide it's not about anything. You're trying to list it so you can really look at the things it is about, but not be upset about the things that it's really not about. The book has a whole bunch of these different techniques, and I'll be just transparent to come back to that theme. There's nothing that just makes everything go away and makes it so that you can really just be a feedback receiving machine. So these things just make things, 30% easier rather than 100% easier. But that 30% can make a big difference. Okay, I need to stop. Let me wish you well receiving feedback. You guys are doing important work, and good luck.